Hello everyone, I'm Inverse, and today we're looking at a modern Wehrmacht build with decidedly retro roots. Now this is a strategy that I first saw about a week ago on elpern's stream. You'll see down here, elpern is one of the players in this game right now, and I also saw him play it in this game, in fact, the game we're watching right now, in the most recent Master League tournament matches this past weekend. Now, if you're not familiar with Master League, it is a recurring series of Company of Heroes 3 tournaments. I highly recommend you check it out. There'll be links in the description to this video for where you can find out about those games. Now, this match is between elpern as Wehrmacht and Kaosak, an American player. And I'm going to be focusing on elpern's strategy here. Now, the reason this is such an interesting strategy to me is because it really harkens back to the late days of Company of Heroes 1 and one of the most popular Wehrmacht standard builds of that time. I'm sure any of you who've been following me from the Company of Heroes 1 times will sort of recognize the roots of this strategy, but for those who are unfamiliar, in Company of Heroes 1, a very popular build was what was sort of colloquially referred to as Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3. The basic concept of the build was that each of those sort of main tiers, Tier 1 for, MGs, Grenadiers, Tier 2 for, Volks Grenadiers in Company of Heroes 1, Tier 2 for Paks and Grenadiers, and then Tier 3 for Pumas, provided you with a very well-rounded, very flexible, and very powerful fighting force, and gave you the opportunity to be very flexible and sort of tailor your build to your opponent's progress and your opponent's tech in the mid-game. And up until this point, primarily because of the weakness of both machine guns and Paks, it was very difficult to come across a similar strategy in Company of Heroes 3. We saw a lot of massed infantry. We saw a lot of rushes to Tier 4. We didn't see very much of this sort of combined arms, mid-game, mid-tier focus in Company of Heroes 3. Now that changed a lot in the recent patch, and you'll notice right now the build order we're looking at here. We've got elpern going for a additional Pioneer squad very early, right away, going for a single Grenadier, and then immediately building 2 MGs. And now we're going to notice something very interesting at this point, is that this is basically where elpern's Tier 1 build is going to stop. And this is sort of a bit of a difference between this build in Company of Heroes 3 and a similar build you'd probably see in Company of Heroes 1. A big reason for this is the simple fact that in Company of Heroes 3, Wehrmacht's early game is not super robust, and their mid-game, and sort of their mid-game infantry in particular, is where a lot of their strength is, where you see things like Jaegers, things like Panzergrenadiers getting a lot of play and being very powerful because they're very specialized units that provide a lot of value. And so sort of a trend we've been seeing in the metagame right now, and you're seeing it right here, is a focus on very short Tier 1s and supplementing Tier 1 infantry with either Tier 2 Luftwaffe, or in this case and in most cases Tier 3, Tier 2.5 if you want to call it, but a Panzergrenadier Kompanie for Panzer Grenadiers. And we'll see in a little bit. I'll sort of pause the game and take a look at Kaosak's unit composition once the Panzer Grenadier hits the field, and we can kind of take a look at why this sort of rush to a quote-unquote mid-tier tech is so powerful. But this sort of rounds out the sort of early to early mid-game portion of the build. Obviously, we're talking Company of Heroes 3, and so we're looking at a very, quick Tier 1, quick early game, both in terms of number of units and the amount of time players are taking in that tier. See, we're at, just over 4 minutes. We've already got tech out. We're already having a Panzer Grenadier coming out on the field, and we'll notice very shortly that we're going to have a pack almost immediately afterwards. This is sort of fairly standard with Company of Heroes 3 these days. There's a heavy emphasis on trying to progress out of base Tier 1 tech as soon as possible and figure out how you can gain a little bit of an advantage over your opponent using some form of tech, even if it's something as simple as a single Panzer Grenadier squad. So we're going to pop the Fog of War now and take a look a little bit at Chaosac's unit composition. If we open the tactical map here, we're going to see we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 rifle squads. We also have a Jeep with Vet 1. We can check the player list here and see Armored Company, which is where this Vet 1 Jeep came from. This means that Chaosac has gone for the 0 CP Vet 1 light vehicles ability from Armor Company. And so Chaosac at this point needs to make some decisions, right? We're going to flip over to his point of view really quickly and take a look at sort of his unit composition, what his choices are, okay? Now, you'll notice right here, Elpern is following up his Panzergrenadier with a pack. And this is sort of the crux of this build, this 1-2 punch of a very fast Panzergrenadier followed by a very fast pack supported with MGs. And it's extremely powerful because the American player at this point doesn't really have much in the way of tech opportunities that give them an advantage against this Wehrmacht unit composition. You'll notice Chaosac's decided to go for a mortar. This is how he's decided to deal with the machine guns. Obviously, that's going to have consequences in terms of delaying his eventual tech, whether that's, you know, grenades and bars, or maybe it's an M8. Perhaps it's one and then the other, which is generally how these sort of mid-games go as an armor player. But he's decided to hopefully get some use out of this mortar, and also delaying his tech at this point. But there's a lot of consequences for that decision. You'll notice, first of all, there's no healing right now. These are all very low health rifle squads, and the sort of matchup of a Panzergrenadier against low health, especially non-upgraded rifle squads, is very lopsided toward the Wehrmacht player. This is a very difficult sort of situation for an American player to be in, having to fight against what is essentially elite infantry in the very early game. This was a unit that came out around the 5-minute mark with, you know, unupgraded rifles, or as we can see right now, upgraded, but not upgraded fully, because we're still missing a few things here. We're missing the munition surplus upgrade, which is going to allow Chaosac to more easily upgrade his rifles with additional bars. We're also missing, you know, the munitions to actually upgrade those bars. So in this instance, we're going to see the munition surplus upgrade come up right now. We've got 4 rifles, which means we're going to need 120 munitions in order to fully upgrade these rifles with additional bars. So we're looking at almost 2 minutes of just pure wait time to even get to the munitions capable to make that change. Now, in the meantime, we see the American player teching up to motor pool. However, let's flip back to Elpern and just sort of look at where he's positioned his build and his unit composition to this point. So we've got very solid anti-infantry. You'll notice he actually lost a machine gun in this building to a mortar. Very unfortunate. Something that you really want to try to avoid as much as possible. But we've got a very solid, very well-rounded unit composition at this point, where you notice the American player had to make some very tough choices, and none of them really give him everything that he's looking for at this still relatively early point in the game, where by getting bars and by getting a motor pool, we are still neglecting healing, only just now getting healing up at the 9-minute mark. Very late for an American player, especially an American player with this low health of rifle squads. And Elpern, in the meantime, is going for mechanized. And now mechanized is the big point in this build that sort of gives us the units to quote-unquote emulate, you know, act like a more traditional Wehrmacht Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3 strategy from Company of Heroes 1. And this is really where the strategy starts looking a lot like that old retro vintage sort of style of play. And the big reason for that is, as I'm sure, you know, anyone who's played a lot of Company of Heroes 3 so far knows, the big difference between Wehrmacht in Company of Heroes 3 versus Company of Heroes 1 is the lack of a unit like the Puma. So Wehrmacht in Company of Heroes 3 does not have the Puma. They have a Wirbelwind in a similar situation. They have a Wirbelwind basically in the Luftwaffe company, which is, you know, one of the tier 2.5 buildings, if you want to call it that. And the issue is it's extremely expensive. It's 50 fuel for the upgrade, 70 fuel for the unit, which means it comes extremely late. And you can't really get multiple, which means you can't have like massive map presence and sort of the flexibility to be all around the map like you would with the Puma in Company of Heroes 1. What Mechanized does, and what you'll see here, is that it gives you the 8rad. Now, a big reason why this wasn't used very much before the most recent patch is because for some reason the Wehrmacht 8rad and the DAC 8rad had different damage profiles. There were some differences in their attributes that basically made it so that the Wehrmacht 8rad was massively weaker than the DAC 8rad. That was changed in the most recent patch, and now the two are identical in terms of stats, which means you're basically looking at a Puma-like unit. It's a call-in, which is, you know, unfortunate. We can get into that a little bit later, but we're looking at a Puma-like unit that gives the Wehrmacht player the opportunity to have this sort of holy grail diversified unit composition of fairly powerful infantry, fairly flexible, powerful vehicles, and decent anti-tank capabilities. Now, the one big difference and a key difference between this strategy and the Company of Heroes 1 strategy, and it's the reason why you're seeing interesting little bug here, but anyways, it's the reason why you're going to see in a lot of these builds either Stugs or multiple Paks. And that is the lack of infantry AT in the Panzergrenadier tier. Whereas those of you who played Company of Heroes 1 will recall tier 2 had both the Pak and the regular Grenadier squads that allowed for Panzer Shreks. In Company of Heroes 3, you need to make a bit more of a sort of conscious decision on whether you want decent AT guns or you want infantry AT. And that complicates this build slightly. What it really does is encourages the Wehrmacht player to build either a second AT gun or a Stug. Stug here, a fairly robust choice because a lot of American players going for easy 8s, which can fairly easily decrew Paks. But what you'll see right now is, all right, we've got the Puma out, we've got the 8rad out, whatever you want to call it at this point, and elpern is sort of using this unit to push forward, take advantage of space, and give the rest of his units an opportunity to cap the rest of the map. So you'll see keeping the Jeep occupied down here on the bottom, having a lot of units around the map, just capping as much as possible, keeping the American player pushed back to their base as much as humanly possible to take advantage of the map control provided by this unit. And another thing I wanted to point out, because it's sort of a striking thing about this game in particular that doesn't always match with these matchups, is you'll notice how late this 8rad came. This is something that's a bit unique, well, very unique, between this strategy and a similar strategy in Company of Heroes 1, where in Company of Heroes 1, the speed and timing of your Puma was really dependent on your opponent's harassability, your map control, and your ability to secure fuel and maintain decent map control and decent... Actually, I think this is maybe the second MG that died. Actually didn't notice that when I watched through this earlier. But anyways, it was really dependent on your ability to maintain decent map control. And that's not exactly the case in Company of Heroes 3, because the fact that the 8rad armored car is behind the 2 CPs after raid package, so 3 CPs total, means you really are dependent on the amount of fighting that you're doing in the early game to actually dictate when this unit is going to be on the field, because you're blocked more by command points than you ever will be by manpower or fuel in this build. You'll notice elpern had enough time to tech all the way up to Stugs and get a Stug out on the field before he even had the CPs for his 8rad. The Stug is a 50 fuel upgrade here and a 60 fuel unit. That's 110 fuel that he put toward a Stug before he could even build an 8-rad, right? So that just goes to show sort of the variance and the variability with this build. I would recommend, as a Wehrmacht player, you try to fight as much as you can. Intelligently, of course, but, you know, take decent engagements. Try to always be engaging your opponent, because the earlier you can get this 8-rad on the field, the more beneficial it's going to be, the more damage you're going to be able to do to your opponent, and the more you're going to be able to push them back. Now, at this point, this is basically the game for elpern. We notice very, very solid unit composition, very solid tech. We've got the Stug, we've got a Pak. He's fairly well positioned against any sort of, you know, vehicle play, whether Chaosac somehow manages to tech 2 Shermans, which isn't very meta right now, or if he goes 8-rad, which, you know, is a lot more meta. But we have a very well-rounded unit composition from elpern, and the key of this is forcing his opponent to react to him instead of the other way around. Wehrmacht players in Company of Heroes 3 are very used to, at least these days, playing a reactive play style. You're really trying to develop an infantry and a unit composition that is best prepared to deal with what your opponent is going to throw at you. And this strategy turns that on its head a little bit, gives you some initiative, gives you the opportunity to, you know, go right now and see, okay, we've got 2 AT guns. Maybe I switch back to anti-infantry and get more Panzergrenadiers. Maybe I double down on 8-rads because I'm banking on my opponent's lack of mobility, and I'm going to use multiple 8-rads to control the map and force my opponent to really try to push in as slowly as I can make them and make their quest to retake parts of the map as excruciating as possible. The big reason why I love this strategy so much is, you know, similar to why I loved the Company of Heroes 1 version of the strategy so much, and why it was sort of my, you know, prime means of playing Wehrmacht in Company of Heroes 1, is just the flexibility, the ability to take initiative away from your opponent, which is something that is generally a little bit challenging to do as Wehrmacht, and your ability to force your opponent to make teching and unit decisions that they might not otherwise want to have to make, because you're forcing them to deviate from the build, the strategy, sort of the setup that they would ideally play. Now that's really sort of what I wanted to cover here. I will post a link to this replay if you guys would like to watch it yourselves after the fact. I'm also going to post a link to the recorded live stream of this game being played during Master League this past weekend, with live commentary on top if you guys want to watch that. I'll also be posting links to all of the streams of all the players in this game. elpern and Chaosac both stream, are both fantastic players to watch and learn from. I highly recommend you take a look at their games. I hope you like this. If you'd like to watch me play, ask me questions, anything like that, I also stream fairly consistently over on twitch.tv/InverseTV. I'm also posting replays, and the community is posting replays fairly frequently over on cohdb.com. Anyone who hasn't been there, hasn't looked at replays, posted replays of their own, I highly recommend you take a look. Contribute to the community. The more replays, the merrier. It's great seeing people posting their games, learning from each other, stuff like that. It's fantastic. But thanks for watching, guys. I super appreciate it. I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you learned something. And until next time, have fun in your games.